morning, everyone. It's really wonderful to see you all here in the room. I want to welcome you folks here and also those who have joined us virtually on Zoom. I'm Amy Liu, and I'm the current president of Brookings, and I'm really excited about the program that we have for you today. What we're doing today is we're going to have a conversation with two mayors who represent the new generation of leadership in our cities. And this is important because at a time when national leaders are often accused of being out of touch, I want to remind folks that mayors are the government that is closest to the people. At a time when many of our democratic institutions are losing trust among people, local government remains one of the most trusted. And at a time when our nation, our globe, are dealing with the upstream effects of inequality and division, mayors are at the front lines of lifting the most vulnerable out of poverty, ensuring underserved workers get access to good jobs, and ensuring quality, affordable housing so they can have access to healthy, secure living for their families and their children. What mayors do matter. And I'm thrilled that Brookings is able to feature two of them today. So with us, we have Mayor Justin Bibb of Cleveland and Mayor Bruce Harrell of Seattle. Both were elected in the fall of 2011, so they are now about 1 year into their first term. Both of them came into office during a change year, in a time which also ushered in a wave of new mayors that were all predominantly leaders of color. Michelle Wu in Boston, Aftam Puravel in Cincinnati, Ed Gaines in Pittsburgh. And both of these mayors govern cities adapting to new realities in the aftermath of COVID-19. And that is the primary focus of our conversation today. So please join us for our conversation using the hashtag #PostPandemicCity. We will have time today for questions from the audience, both those here in the room and those that have joined us on Zoom. For those who've already submitted questions, I have them, so thank you so much. And as you listen to this conversation today and you want to add your questions to this conversation, you can do so on Twitter using again, hashtag #PostPandemicCity and mentioning @Brookings Metro, or you can email directly to the event's email address that's on the event page here, and we will make sure we get to your questions. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to jump right in, and I want to say first and foremost that I really would love to start with a little background. I want to hear about the mayor's bio, and so both of these mayors were born in the cities that they now govern. So I'm going to start with you, Mayor Harrell. Describe the neighborhood you grew up in and how that has shaped your lens as mayor.
Thank you. Thanks for that kind introduction, too, in your sort of setup. So the neighborhood I grew up in is known in Seattle as the Central District. And my grandfather, who was African-American, had moved from New Orleans, Louisiana, and took his three sons, my father being one of them. And we were redlined back then in the 50s, and so there was only a certain area where African Americans could live, and that was known as the Central District. Now the Central District's population of the African American community has gone down significantly. It's pretty low, it's single-digit percentages, of course, and it's become one of the most highly desirable parts of the core city. The house that I grew up in, which my parents bought for $6,000, that same house, same footprint, same square footage is an $850,000 house now. So clearly that area has become very unaffordable for a teacher or a social worker. And my parents were not college educated, and so it was a great place for them to raise a family. I attended public schools there in Seattle, but the area has significantly changed. And I think many of you might have read the book, The Warmth of Other Suns, by Isabel Wilkerson. And so that was part of the migration movement for my grandfather. But it's still near and dear. I spent a lot of time in the Central District, near and dear to me. And we're doing everything possible to, again, fight displacement in many ways, not just brick and mortar, but cultural displacement, the use of arts. But yeah, it has changed. There's no doubt about that.
Mayor Bibb?
Well, just like Mayor Harrell, I'm a proud byproduct of the great urban migration. Both of my grandparents moved to Cleveland from the segregated South, from Alabama and Georgia. I was born and raised in the southeast side of Cleveland in the Mount Pleasant, Union Miles neighborhood. And at the height of Cleveland's growth in the early 1950s, this was a Jewish neighborhood. Then you see white flight, forced integration in housing, and it became a middle-class black neighborhood. And when I was growing up in the early 1990s, on my block called Dove, we had some of the highest rates of poverty, some of the highest rates of drug addiction because of the prevalence of crack cocaine in our neighborhood. But it was still a working-class community where I could ride my bike all across the community. When those street lights came on and my parents weren't home, someone was going to make sure I was in the house. But it's lost that social cohesiveness and fabric right now. And so we are working around the clock to make that part of the city, the Cleveland's east side, a beacon for the black middle class once again. And that's a really critical part of my economic vision for the city of Cleveland moving forward.
So let's stay with that,
Yeah.
Mayor Bibb. Tell everyone here, what is the vision and agenda your administration is pursuing in your term?
Well, when I took office, our city was facing a number of uphill battles. Number one, in 2020, we were ranked the worst city in America for black women. At the height of the pandemic, we were ranked the least connected city in America when it comes to access to high-speed broadband. And last year, we were the poorest big city in America. And so we took office on a very clear mandate. Number one, how do we be a model for not just effective, thoughtful law enforcement in Cleveland, but also real police accountability? We are the only city in America that's been under 2 consecutive consent decrees with the Department of Justice. And just last year, we saw a 10% reduction in gun-related homicides, but we still have a long way to go to keep our community safe. Secondly, I was the first new mayor in nearly 2 decades. And so we've been working around the clock to modernize our city hall to make sure all of our employees have an email account, which is crazy, by the way, to make sure they have the tools they need to deliver on basic city services. But lastly, you know, one thing we didn't do a good enough job in Cleveland after the Great Recession, Pittsburgh, Nashville, they were really aggressive and really pitching their cities to the world. And as we come out of this pandemic, I believe this is going to be the era of the mid-sized city, and I want to make sure that Cleveland is at the top of that list to lead the next chapter of America's economic growth story.
That's great. Mayor Harrell?
And I should give some context, too, that I have these notes here, not necessarily to read, but to take notes from Mayor Bibb, because he's clearly a superstar, and we belong to the same fraternity together, so I'm just scribbling. I'm going to use some of your ideas for Seattle. All right. So when we took office, we come up with this notion, this concept that we are driving called One Seattle. Because Seattle, it is a city known for, we're a blue city in a blue state. We're known for compassion, we're known for innovation and excellence, but it's gotten very radioactive in politics. I mean, between the mayor, the municipal court system, the elected city attorney, and the executive, no one was listening, everyone was shouting. And so when you look at the stronger, the elements of an ecosystem, whether it's climate change or transportation or public safety, I'd come up with said in One Seattle, number one, we'd lead with listening, we'd lead with data, we lead with facts, we lead with equity. And we put all this into an environment of listening and rebuilding systems, internal systems on how our city employees, 12,000 of them. We have a strong mayor system, so I'm actually in parades and making financial fiscal decisions. And I said, that will dominate our culture. And when we talk about race, when we talk about income inequality, all of the the radioactive subjects that this country continues to grapple with, we will show as an example in this country how we have that kind of discourse. Are we there yet? No. But my job as mayor is to lead those discussions. I think particularly, and I have a unique advantage. I tell people that I'm biracial. I'm half Japanese and half black. And when I look at race as an example, I see it through my lens, which may not be your lens. So I have to work equally hard to find out your lens. So in One Seattle, in all of the components, we lead with that. And quite frankly, we've done incredibly well. These are tough issues we're dealing with when we're redefining a city. All of us are redefining the city right now. We're going through a change that we didn't anticipate. There's no playbook on this. Well, here's the playbook right here, by the way. So our One Seattle gives us the narrative and the conceptual foundation, if you will, to build greatness and excellence, and that's what we're doing.
So I'm going to ask this next question to Mayor Harrell, but it's obviously for both of you, and I want to start to get into the specifics about some of the new realities that face many of our cities in this post-pandemic environment. And if there's anything that is constant, is change. And one of the new realities now is the fact that the rise of remote work and hybrid work has completely changed the composition and demand for space in our downtowns, which have been at the heart of many of our communities. It's been the heart of the fiscal base of many cities. And obviously, many of these places rely on office workers and businesses to support the eateries, the small mom and pop shops, the mass transit, that, again, are kind of part of the fabric of many of our cities. So what I was going to ask you, Mayor Harrell, and by the way, there is a group of folks here in the room and in Brookings Metro that's actually focused on the future of future of our downtowns in many of our cities. So, Mayor Harrell, how are you experiencing that trend in Seattle, and what are the steps you're taking on that?
Sure, thank you. Well, the first thing I set with the narrative that we're bullish on downtown, that this is our economic gem, and the reality is that I have to lead with that because that's where the action is in our city. We love our neighborhoods, we love our communities, but the fact is in downtown Seattle that we have to talk about it. We have to be bold enough and creative enough to realize that the 9 to 5 downtown is no longer going to take place with e-commerce, consumer habits, with what's happening in downtowns. Now we have to rethink. And therein lies, I think, the greatest opportunity for us young mayors. That, we have over 100,000 people living downtown. It's a neighborhood. Some of the brick and mortar institutions will no longer be there. We're not trying to revert back to the good old days. So now, do we have what I call coffee corners? Do we have neighborhood gatherings? Do I use the built environment to think about how I light areas? Do I bring in music, arts, culture? We have an abundance of musical talent in Seattle, so how do I use this to get people to come? And quite frankly, how do I even use the faith-based communities to say, we love what you do on Sundays or Saturdays, but now how can we also talk to the people who need help? Because we have people who are crying for help. Many of them have behavioral issues, and how do I make sure that they get the service that they need? So it's an activation plan. And we know activation is what changes lives, changes the culture. And we got, maybe in one of the questions, we have some great projects, physical projects in Seattle, like our waterfront or our convention center. So this is where the action is, but it starts, I think, by saying that the good old days are gone. Mm-hmm. And now daycare centers, for example, we know there's high need for daycare. Educational schools, there's educational institutions. This is what we're revisioning, and this is where, quite frankly, our work with Brookings is coming in incredibly valuable, because as we reimagine, we need a think tank. It's hard enough for us to just fill potholes, right? Mm-hmm. So this reimagining, we do need the think tank with us, and we're pretty excited about the work we're doing together.
Mayor Harrell mentions a good point. We are not going to a pre-pandemic point of view when it comes to our central business districts. And this is personal for me because as mayor of Cleveland, I live downtown. I've lived downtown for the last 9 years. I've been in the city since I moved back from New York. And for me, I find a lot of joy by being in the center of our city. And we want to do a couple of things to really make our downtown a thriving place long term. Number one, I think we as mayors need to adopt this business point of view where it's going from a central business district to a community business district. So what does that mean? Well, say you're working at a bank or a law firm or a tech company. You may go in the office 3 days out of the week. But the other 2 days, we want to activate other spaces downtown. That's a third space to get a cup of coffee, see a colleague, maybe go to yoga, and then have back on your laptop. Those are the kind of public spaces we need to create in our downtowns for them to be competitive long term. What we're seeing in Cleveland is a couple of things. Number one, We're already at 60% of where we were pre-pandemic in terms of office occupancy, and up to 80% in terms of foot traffic in the core of our downtown. Those are all positive metrics for us long term. The other thing that we're trying to do is, you may not know this, but Cleveland, what I'm calling America's North Coast, has a world-class lakefront that is yet to be maximized. Over 13 miles, 2,000 acres of prime time lakefront real estate on the coast of Lake Erie. So we are entering major investments, stealing something from Seattle, creating a waterfront development authority to make this a world-class asset, to poach talent from Chicago and New York to say, you can have a great apartment and not spend $5K a month like you're spending in New York, but maybe $2K a month right on the lake. And we think that'll be a great asset to position our downtown for the future.
I have so many questions for them because I think about, as mayors, they are constantly multitasking. And as you think about the future of downtowns, you cannot ignore neighborhoods. I want to come back to that. But for a moment, I want to stick to the downtown because the other related issues is crime and homelessness, which are often associated for the whole city, but particularly noticeable or concerned by occupants in the district. So let me start with policing. And I think policing is another one of those issues that has become polarizing in the wake of COVID-19. We know that the death and murder of George Floyd and many other incidents of police brutality exposed in 2020 and moving forward has sort of sparked a racial reckoning, a commitment to racial equity, reducing structural inequality in many of our cities. And at the same time, there's now an entire debate about the proper way to promote safety, reduce crime in our cities. And so this confluence between public safety, the blue and the black, has been sort of at the center of the urban agenda, and even now our national politics. So Mayor Bibb, I would just ask you, what's your approach to policing? I know you've made some really incredible progress on criminal justice reform with the governor. Just give us a sense of your approach here and the new partnerships you have underway.
Well, this is personal for me. My dad was a police officer for nearly 30 years in the greater Cleveland area. And I remember these very vivid conversations with my pops. As a black kid with a somewhat nice car going to high school, when I got pulled over, what would I say when I got pulled over? It was yes, sir, no, sir, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, 2 hands on the wheel. And Cleveland, for a long time, has been a case study on how not to do policing in America. Tamir Rice, Tanisha Anderson, the issue with 137 shots several years ago in our city. And last year, I was the only candidate in our mayor's race, rather, in 2021, to endorse a ballot initiative to create the toughest independent civilian oversight board in America on policing. And we just sworn in our commission last December. So I believe we can back the blue, but also hold them accountable when they got out of line, because as mayors, we have to have that dual mandate. So we've done a couple of things in Cleveland. Number one, we negotiated an 11% pay increase in 4 months after taking office without going to arbitration to better invest in law enforcement. But we're also doing some things that change the culture of our department. Prior to taking office, our cops couldn't wear ball caps, couldn't have beards, or wear tattoos. So we're losing a lot of our young cops to the suburbs because of these small cultural things. We changed that. The other thing that we did was we mandated that every cop in all 5 of our police districts has to walk the beat for at least 1 hour for first and second shift to increase that visible police presence. And so on the front end, we're trying to change the culture. But on the back end, however, we know that we need to redesign what public safety looks like in the future. So it's more investments in our co-responder model of policing and making sure that mental health professionals are joining our cops for nonviolent 911 calls. So we are truly addressing the root causes of violent crime in our city.
Mayor Harrell.
Well, I don't know what image comes to mind when you think of Seattle. You may think of Microsoft or Amazon or Starbucks or Boeing, but we too have been under a consent decree for interregional force. And we've had some very unfortunate incidents in Seattle of police misconduct and regional force. We hope to be out from under that decree this year. We have a demoralized police department, and our numbers, I've been elected 4 times in Seattle, and I'll tell you, I was public safety chair for 4 years and vice chair for 4 years, so I had 8 years as a policy lead. And we've had a mass exodus of police officers, and so one of the first things I did, Mayor, was I went to every precinct, all 5 precincts, every shift. Some of these are 3 a.m. shifts, to talk to the officers and say, together, how can we build trust? I will tell you, my expectation as your mayor. And again, we will be masters of de-escalation. When you see anyone you arrest, I want you to see your brother, your sister, your mother or father in the eyes of that person. And quite frankly, if you can't do that, you don't need to be a police under my control, under my influence. Let's work together and build trust. Trust is not given easily. We have to build it, be intentional. So we're looking at investments. How do I get my officers down at ball fields and in schools, back in schools? The schools are not willing to receive a lot of our police officers now. So we're down to about 940, 950 officers, not that I'm counting. We should have around 14 to 1,500, but we're also creating a 3rd department because we recognize we're having our officers go to situations where they should not go to. I need a mental health counselor. I need someone that perhaps speaks English as a second language, someone that's culturally competent. So this 3rd department, I have a police chief, a fire chief, in this 3rd department, a name to be created. By the way, I have 2 folks here that were put, and we've actually made a hiring decision for that chief. It will be a chief position. So we think that integrated with our 2 traditional historical fire and police are going to prove to our city that, yes, we lead with compassion, but make no mistake about it, I do want our parks safe, I want our streets safe. That is a unifying element, by the way. That goes beyond race. I want to protect my black babies as much as I want to protect any other baby or any other elderly person in our city. I want 7-minute response times. Life is too precious. So, and I could probably say things, again, being a local person in our city, that some can't. Because I didn't say I'm defunding. I said, in fact, I'm funding because I need that kind of excellence in the department.
Mayor Harrell, well, I know you've made homelessness a top priority for your administration, and obviously this is another issue that has been very much exposed during the pandemic when everyone had to work from home and cities were sort of in shutdown mode, and yet many people didn't have access to secure house. And even then, the wares of mental health and other stresses has even worsened during this time. And so homelessness has become an issue in sort of the high inequality excesses in some ways of your big coastal tech city. Talk about your now approach to homelessness 1 year in, and any lessons you have even for other mayors.
You know, first, I mean, every major city seems to be grappling with the issue of a subclass of poverty. I mean, we've created a subclass of wealth that I didn't think people would be worth $150, $180 billion, and money being a finite resource. It has to come from somewhere. And now you're seeing teachers and social workers, again, at the brink of poverty. And so this subclass of poverty now, coupled with the abundance of fentanyl and drug addiction and a rampant, just easy access to illicit drugs, that you're seeing people that did not have the safeguards in place extremely vulnerable. I don't fight for the status quo, as I say routinely, and so what we do is we will lead always with housing. We have a housing first policy that if I'm removing someone, we'll offer them shelter. But shelter's not enough, and I think we have to understand that. I could put a roof over someone's head or give them warm water and food, but that's not enough, and so we tap into our community-based organizations, our faith communities. And I'm saying, again, it's good what you do on Sundays or Saturdays, but I need you downtown as an example to talk about people who, quite frankly, have lost their way. You know, I spend time in the schools, and if you look at a 3rd grader, I have 2 granddaughters around that age group, they're just full of life. There's nothing they believe they can't do. Their hands are up. They're on their I want to answer that question. They're not afraid to make a fool of themselves. And so where did that break down in their lives? And so let's go upstream and figure out where our systems are falling. And that's how we look at the homeless community not as them, but as our brothers and sisters. This is hard work because people want immediate satisfaction. They want them not only housed, and quite frankly, they don't want to see them often. But I will say, as the mayor, that you will see them and you help me treat them. And so we also have to build entry points for people to want to help. Our strongest asset in Seattle are our people. And I'll ask, if you are all Seattleites, oh, you guys aren't cool enough to be Seattleites, by the way, but if you are those cool Seattleites, I would say, how many of you are willing to help me help the problem, solve the problem? And every hand will go up, but they don't know their entry points. So I give to United Way, for example. No, we're going to do more than that. So in our One Seattle approach, we're building entry points for everyone to help. And that's how I think we're going to have to go about this.
I'm going to turn this now to Mayor Bibb, and I think you teed it up very well, Mayor Harrell, which is that the subclass of poverty and the focus on poverty also means that any one Seattle or one Cleveland has to include every zip code. And so much of the sources of poverty is based on where you live in the city. So Mayor Bibb, I know you have a major focus on neighborhood-based opportunity and transformation. Talk about some of the new approaches you're undertaking, because this is something that every city has been tackling with, but I think you're trying to kind of create some new practices and institutional capacities.
Well, first, I want to just thank Brookings for their early support of our administration in Cleveland. Thank God we have a president in the White House who believes that we change America one city at a time. And the American Rescue Plan investments have been a lifeline to my city to make sure we didn't have to lay off firefighters, police officers, and first responders and folks who pick up our trash and get our snow up, because without the ARPA investments, we have no idea where our country would be right now. And so when we took office, we created what we called our Center for Economic Recovery, a policy leadership team of my cabinet, really making sure we invest in transformational projects to really set up Cleveland for the next generation. And not just a wish list of pet projects from City Council, but smart, focused investments to make sure we have an inclusive economic recovery, housing for all, so investments in home repair, particularly for our seniors, and access to capital fund to help minority developers get the capital they need to develop housing stock across Cleveland. But we're also doing a major economic development sites strategy in Cleveland, because through a research project we did, we found that we owned nearly $2 billion of vacant land in my city that's yet to be developed. So we're in early conversations with the governor to figure out how do we have a very focused sites development strategy to create more jobs hubs in the urban core of our city. Because if you can walk to a job within 15 minutes, can walk to a grocery store within 15 minutes, have access to good transit within 15 minutes, that's how you build a long-term economic wealth in our cities, and we want to have a hyper-local approach to economic development on that sense.
Great. Mayor Harrell, I think maybe just to tee off of this, Mayor Bibb just talked about the importance of an unprecedented level of federal investments in cities and in place-based economic opportunity. And there's no doubt, I think what I want to do is pivot now to a conversation about these federal investments in cities. This includes the American Rescue Plan, which gave flexible dollars to every single municipality around the country to address some of the historic scars and challenges exposed by the pandemic. There is the infrastructure bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, which had huge investments around clean energy solutions, environment and climate change, and the CHIPS and Science Act, which will continue to expand the innovation capacity, the skills capacity of all of our major urban centers. So I would just ask Mayor Harrell, as you think about place-based neighborhood strategies, what is your approach to all this unprecedented federal investments? How are you organizing all of these resources to put a major down payment on sort of any bold plans you have for the future of Seattle?
Yes, and I really appreciate Mayor Bibb's description of it being a lifeline, I think, because it truly was. One of the first things we have to do is we have to be able to act quickly. We have to be nimble, and the federal funds allowed us to do that. We have to acquire hotels, for example, any good housing that when we're competing against the private market for some of these investments, this allowed us the flexibility and the resilience to make faster purchases and to compete. That became critical. We are also a city of bridges, as an example. If you've come to Seattle, and we had our West Seattle Bridge, which is a whole, I don't know, a third of our city out of commission for a while to be able to drive across. I had to drive it took 45 minutes to drive, which should be 5 or 10 minutes. And so on some of our core infrastructure needs, I had come into office, I said, okay, we want some new shiny things, but we have to go back to the basics at first. So some of our core infrastructure projects just helped out a lot. Public safety is one of our highest priorities. And so when we looked at, we put, for example, in some of the vacant storefronts, we've put around 30 businesses in what would just be dilapidated or unused area to activate them. And along this way, we are very intentional about looking at historically who's been left out of these conversations of reimagining or revisioning a city. African Americans, black, brown people from the immigrant community have traditionally been locked out. So we've been very intentional when we talk about leading with equity, making sure they are at the table, making decisions with what a new Seattle will look like. So in that sense, we're bringing in small entrepreneurs. We're very happy. Like I said, you'll see in downtown areas, if I see plywood's my enemy. So I tell folks I want to see windows, and we use some of these funds for window repair, because you tell a small business owner that woke up and had a window shattered, have a good day. No, they need money. And so, again, we're looking at how we use those funds to, again, uplift all communities, activate certain areas, be nimble, and look at our core competencies, whether it's bridge, small businesses, brick and mortar, that are now competing in an e-commerce world.
Yeah, let me build on that because, and it builds on your point about who you're engaging in these investments. I think on the surface, any casual reader about all these federal investments and flowing to communities would argue that this seems like a boondoggle. This seems excessive, and so on. I do think, and this is sort of the bias from the Brookings perch, is that a lot of these investments really are meant to change inequality, to change the status quo of how our communities and the economy is produced and planned and created. And there's a lot of bias and bad behaviors, whether it's, about who benefits, where opportunity is created, or whether or not we're perpetuating, continue to expose families or neighborhoods to the ravages of climate change and tornadoes, and not investing in more safe and sustainable solutions. So I guess my question for you is, what are you doing to make sure that these investments actually do not perpetuate status quo outcomes, but result in truly more just, more long-term dynamic, or environmentally sound investments in our communities?
Well, I can chime in on the Inflation Reduction Act. We have never seen a national commitment to address climate justice like we've seen through the Inflation Reduction Act. Cleveland is one of the 40 Justice 40 initiatives and communities that this administration has identified. We are at the vanguard of the climate justice movement in this country, because our river caught on fire nearly 50 years ago, the Cuyahoga River. And then the first black mayor of a major American city, Carl Stokes, crisscrossed the nation on a pollution tour, which led to the Clean Water Act, which then led to the EPA. So we have a special focus in Cleveland on really being a national leader on climate justice. And so we're doing a couple of things. Number one, we just did a ribbon cutting in a poor, underserved black neighborhood to create the first ever EV charging station in that neighborhood. So if you can buy a Tesla or whatever car you might have, you can charge it in the hood. That's a big deal, a huge deal. The other thing we're really focused on is really make sure that the broad-based benefits of the green economy can be realized in low-income communities of color, helping them put solar on their homes at no cost so they can lower their energy burden long-term. The other thing I really want to lift up and champion is that, for a long time we've had politicians talk about the importance of we got to make things in America again, America first. But we actually had a president, President Biden, who got the CHIPS bill done. And now we're going to see a concerted effort right here in this country, particularly in the Midwest, to build chips in America, which I think this new industrial policy is going to make Cleveland go from the Rust Belt to the Silicon Heartland to really show we can make things in states like Ohio and make sure that black and brown workers are getting the real benefits of that new industrial policy.
Mayor Harrell?
Yeah, I'd like to first start off with a complaint about this forum. Can you have a less talented mayor when I'm on this damn stage next time? Because we're doing a lot of that as well about the universal charging stations. But in all seriousness, I think you're the fourth African-American mayor in Cleveland's history, as I get my facts right. And I'm the second person of color. First biracial, they say second black mayor, first Asian mayor. I don't know how that plays out in our history, the second person of color. And I think that doesn't make me better or inferior, but it certainly does bring a lesson of being excluded from certain conversations, as my mother and father was. I think many of you know my mother was interned during World War II, as a lot of Japanese Americans were. So we know what exclusion's about. So I say that to say this, that in the work that we're doing, I'm putting structure in place. There's one group, for example, in Seattle called Tabor 100. It's named after a African-American electrician that did a lot of contracting for minority for the government in this organizations for minority-owned businesses, like a small chamber of commerce, if you will. But in there, we're doing strategic planning. They have a huge building that they allow technical assistance, and they partner with many large companies to build that relationship capital. So what will be sustainable, again, is looking at from a lens of who's been excluded, is I'm putting structure around such that these relationships are formed. One of the things that we are deficient in, particularly in certain communities, is relationship capital. We just don't have the relationships. And so one of the advantages of this job, people do return our calls. Yeah. So how do I share that with the underrepresented groups? And this is actually, again, fun work because Seattle is progressive enough to where people will help. But I also say this, my wife and I have 3 children. I believe in tough love, and so I tell anyone that owns a business, bring your A game. Don't bring a substandard product or service. And if you are substandard, let me get you the skills to make sure that you are optimally performing, because I will give you the relationships. So that's where the sustainability comes in, and I had to put, again, structure. Instead of just dealing with one company here, and by the way, we're working with the University of Washington, Seattle University, and this Tabor group putting together a consortium to make sure I have that sustainable structure as we use these dollars that come into our city.
So we're going to turn to audience questions in just a few minutes. So so please think about questions you want to ask the mayors, and I will also encourage those online to also submit any questions via, again, Twitter or through the email address that's on the webpage if you want to ask questions. Let me ask you this: you both are in town for the U.S. Conference of Mayors. You'll be interacting with a lot of a lot of federal officials, as well as other peer mayors. What do you hope to get out of your visit this week?
I would say the future of this country is not going to come from D.C. It's not going to come from D.C. It's going to come from Cleveland, Seattle, Pittsburgh, Tulsa, Nashville. And we as a nation must do a better job of lifting these cities, because if we can show you how to change policing in Cleveland, that's a big deal. And we can show you how to change how we think about serving our homeless population in Seattle, that's a big deal. Congress needs to pay attention to American cities, because the mayor and I don't have the luxury of passing the buck to the next congressional session, because when we go to church or in the grocery store, they're going to tell us like it is every single day. And if Congress took some more lessons from us mayors, I think this country would be a lot better off. Great answer. You didn't leave me any for.
I have a fun. I'm the. If you haven't picked up by now, I'm the youngest in a family, so I always go second, and I wait to pick and choose my moves in a discussion as the baby child. Number one, ideas. And I'm in all seriousness, I get some of my greatest ideas when I come here to the Conference of Mayors. What's working, what's not working, because I will try. I'm bold enough to try something. Number two, relationships with our federal government. I need to bring back can you still say bring back the bacon? Is that am I dating? Okay. So the relationships with our federal representatives from the cabinet leaders, they have to know that, quite frankly, we have some great stuff happening in Seattle, but we need the resources. And I guess thirdly, I would say, again, it inspires me. I look for inspiration wherever I can go. And I ask young people, well, where do you find inspiration? Is it a book, a movie? I find it around people that are called to service, called to public service. In fact, all of you here for a reason, that you're trying to get ideas, you're trying to build relationships. And so that's what this conference does for me. It re-energizes me on doing what I like to do. It's fun. So, I guess that'll be the fourth one too. Fun. I like having fun. And
I can't keep up with him in fun, by the way.
And you have fun when you get the ideas, you have the relationships, you're finding resources. And that's why this conference, I think, is off to a great start. And I got to say, I give Brookings a plug because they have been such a strong think tank for our city that it's been invaluable in what we're trying to do in Seattle.
Thank you very much for that, Mayor. And I will make sure you get the first shot at the next question.
I
How
don't
about
want
that?
if you thought that's what I meant, that's the opposite of what I meant. I like second position.
Okay, it's your turn. Raise your hand if you have any questions, and please introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Alex. I'm a lifelong Seattleite. So, based off your previous comments, cool enough to be a Seattleite. I was born and raised in West Seattle.
I recognize your swag, Alex, as soon as you stood up.
Great. Went to University of Washington. Anyways, I would agree with your earlier comments that Seattle is, of course, a very compassionate city. But for many of my friends and family who are still in Seattle, that compassion is really being tested with the homeless situation. So you also spoke about long-term solutions to the homeless crisis, and I agree. A lot of my work and research is focused on that. But what about those short-term solutions? What are some short-term solutions to address the homeless crisis that is attentive, first and foremost, to the homeless population, but also other residents in Seattle who have valid concerns about health and safety of their streets? And just a small anecdote. Last time I was in downtown Seattle, you also mentioned focus on downtown Seattle. There were entire sidewalks I could not walk down due to the number of tents there. And of course, that's first and foremost an issue for the homeless population there. That's where the compassion should be. But it's also emblematic of real concerns that residents have too when they can't use sections of downtown Seattle.
Yeah, it's a great question. The first thing I should have made clear is that we, a few years ago, made it very clear that Seattle couldn't solve it alone. So we developed a group called the King County Regional Homelessness Authority. And we as a Seattle fund about 70% of that. And that is where the strategies of homelessness are embedded. They actually do the work. I think they have 60 plus employees. They have leadership in place. And so we are funding that. The county funds the other 30%. So that's the core of our work. Our policies, as I said earlier, are leading with housing first policy. Now, that gives me 30% of my human services department to do the ancillary work, which is, again, coordinating. You talked about the health piece, coordinating remember the state and the county are in the health space, not the city. But what we can do is coordinate these different functions. So last week I literally had a meeting with some of the health providers to talk about what does health look like, what does preventative work look like. So that's the role the city could be in. Now, I don't know if you've been to Seattle recently, but we've had to do removals. We lead with housing because, again, a person in a wheelchair can't get down the streets. And so we've been pretty effective. But again, the struggle we have is that the sheer numbers of people experiencing homelessness are just incredible. And as we shift to a regional approach, I have to impress upon people everywhere we go is that we're not demonizing those experiencing homelessness. I also had to open up all the data to show to people that there is a correlation between some of our crime trends, some of our shots fired, and the homelessness community. Again, not to demonize anyone, just to be open and transparent about the safety issues it presents. So we've done very well in terms of changing the narrative and doing this substantive work to get people in shelter. But I have to just tell you, I asked for, I used the word grace. I said that we work 7 days a week. You probably put 6 days a week? No, I know how Mayor Bibb works, in all seriousness. And so, and this is a wake-up call while we're here in D.C., is this is what's happening to our country. I go to these other cities and I see the same problems. Again, our housing first approach and our regional approach, we think, makes sense. And there are some other mayors of other cities here in Washington that are part of that journey with me in our regional approach.
Great.
Hi, good morning. My name is Tanya Golash Boza, and I'm your new neighbor. I'm the executive director of the University of California, Washington Center, just across the street. These conversations about cities often tend to focus on professional workers and then the homeless. But there's a whole nother group of people that make cities run, bus drivers, Uber drivers, people that work at Target, people that work at CVS, fast food restaurants, et cetera. And we're increasingly facing a situation where they can't afford to live in cities. I don't know exactly what it's like in Seattle or Cleveland, but in San Francisco, for example, we have a whole army of Uber drivers that come in on the weekends to transport all these highly paid professionals to parties, and they live 100 miles away. So I'm just curious, what programs have you seen, what plans you have in place to make sure that workers are paid a living wage and are paid enough to actually live in the cities that they serve and that they actually literally make function?
Well, that's an important point you bring up. It's a national issue in terms of income inequality that we see across America. We certainly think we are an affordable place to raise a family and to live and to start a business in Cleveland, but we still have issues with poverty. As I said before, now we're the second poorest big city in America. A majority of our residents in Cleveland spend 40% of their income on housing and transit costs. And so, as mayor, I believe the best thing we can do is build an economy where if you're willing to work hard, you have access to a high sustaining wage to live a life of dignity. That's why we're really focused on leveraging investments we've gotten from the American Rescue Plan. We just put $10 million from ARPA to build a pipeline of workers in the green economy and smart manufacturing and in construction, because we have massive amounts of demand in those sectors, and we want to make sure that we're exposing not just our adult workers, but our children in middle school and high school about the jobs of the future. The second thing I think we're really focused on as well is if you want to build a company and get an incentive from us as the city of Cleveland, we want to make sure we tailor those incentives to high-paying jobs, particularly for Cleveland residents. So you're not going to get any city money without a targeted incentives that does just that. And so we have to use the bully pulpit of our offices to drive that strategy to address income inequality long term. But I also say this, Congress needs to pass a real federal minimum wage that's with real dignity as well too, and supporting our unions is also a big part of this effort as well.
I really love your question because you described my mom and dad, a construction line worker, and my mother, a secretary at a YMCA that couldn't afford to live now in the core city. So we're doing a few things. Number one, to cut the cost of housing down as much as possible. Our administration is trying to just cut the red tape, that the design review process, not with compromising any of the community input, but making sure we could streamline the process to get the cost of housing down. We also tap into some of these great private-public partnerships. Microsoft, example, who are giving literally hundreds of millions of dollars into housing. And I say, in not a overly critical manner, but in a critical manner, that a lot of the costs, the cost to live in Seattle just didn't happen overnight, that you are extracting billions of dollars from a community and you have an obligation, and I will use the word moral obligation, to give back to those who are you hurting. So you see through their corporate social responsibility efforts a lot of work that they're doing. I guess the other thing is, as the leader, we've put in over $250 million in housing, and unprecedented, the highest number of housing dollars that the city has ever done, because housing becomes so critical. It's a tool for generational wealth. The other piece is to make sure that people have access to education. We use our soda tax, our sweetened beverage tax, and we use that money to give kids coming out of high school free tuition to a college for the first year. We call it the 13th year in some circles, because it gives them that 13th year to find out where they're doing. And then through that program, they sort of get their sea legs together and figure out what they're going to do. So we're looking at a holistic approach to make sure people can have access to an opportunity, but we put hard money into housing, and then what I can control again are the permit process, things like that, to make sure we're expediting the outcome of housing.
Let me take one question from online, and then I'll turn to you in just a moment. One of the questions we received online was about to what extent or how are each of you using technology and embracing technology as part of your agenda? And I assume that is both just within your own governing and delivery of services, but also probably throughout the city. And I do say that's a great question, because that's another issue that has been exposed by the pandemic, is the incredible growth of adoption of new technologies, touchless technologies, remote work, systems talking to each other. So to what extent is the city government, not a laggard, but really embracing these new technologies in its performance, both government and throughout the city?
Well, I get to go first. So I'm usually, like I said, I like playing cleanup, so I could have time to think. So number one, I can't say enough about what we're doing, what we're trying to do, because we have some plans that we'll do now. Remember, we just got our budget passed, so I inherited a budget from the previous mayor. Number one is we look at the homelessness community, for example, and we're trying to integrate all of our systems such we know what their needs are, who they are, what we can do without violating principles of privacy, but how can we use technology to actually serve people better? Under our One Seattle approach, again, people can now pay their power bill or their water bill online, but how else can they interface with the city, and how easy can it be? Again, we have privacy laws in place. We've been pretty aggressive on our privacy act. That's a city ordinance that we look about what we do with customer information, but how seamless and how easy can we make it to interface with the city? What is your interface with the city? You pay the bill. Well, we want more. We want to talk to you. Find it, fix it apps, things like that some other cities are employing. The other piece of that is, technology is good in and of itself, but who is not digitally literate? Who can't use it? So again, looking at some of the grants we give to communities, who's doing that work to teach someone 80 years old? My mother was learning email at 80, and I couldn't get her off the computer after she learned how to use some of this stuff. And so we have to look at communities where we're deficient and actually invest. And this is, again, where our private-public partnerships come in, because they may see potential consumers of their products and services. I just see us addressing the digital divide. Public safety is another component of it. I mean, there's so many cool things out there that we could use to protect people. Again, I use the word privacy, because I've had to, of course, have debates with the ACLU on some of my use of technology. We're going to have later today a panel on cybersecurity, so I'm aware of the pitfalls of overusing technology without the proper safeguards. But again, I've already talked to 2 or 3 vendors. It's amazing what's out there and how we can help cities. So we're sort of all in that regard.
My first month in office, I had 2 stark examples of how far behind we were as a city in terms of being a modern and responsive city hall. The first being, I had this big dream and vision of sending my day 1 letter to all 8,000 employees across the city when I took office. I got sworn in at midnight on January 3rd. I couldn't sleep, so I was at the office at about 6 o'clock in the morning, that same morning. And it took me nearly 5 hours to get my email set up. 5 hours. So that day 1 letter became a day 2 letter, by the way. The other thing that happened is we had 2 back-to-back snowstorms this time last year, nearly 15 inches of snow. I got my butt kicked. We got our butt kicked as a city on those snowstorms. And what we quickly discovered is that many of our snowplow drivers were using 200-page binders of maps and highlighters to track their routes in real time, by the way. So within a year, we did a couple things. Number one, we made sure that 98% of all of our employees had access to Microsoft 365 because before that they didn't have it. Some departments were on Windows 10, others were on Windows 7. So we fixed that. Secondly, we brought in a tech company called Rubicon. Now we have a snowplow tracker online, and we have GPS maps and routing technology in all of our snowplow trucks across the entire city. Now we're still testing and making sure that that system is efficient and delivering for our residents, but we were miles behind in terms of where Seattle, Pittsburgh, and other cities were, and I'm just trying to make sure we get caught up, but also accelerate where we are as a city so we can be a leader and not a laggard like we've been the last 2 decades.
Windows 7?
Yes.
You might as well have said 8-track tape.
Yeah, tell me about it.
Okay, we have time for one more question, and we're going to get them to this gentleman right here.
Thank you. Curtis Valentine with the Progressive Policy Institute. Amazing things happening in Cleveland. Mount Olivet Baptist Church, Joanne Colvin doing great work with Google. This is about post-pandemic leadership. Coming out of the pandemic, I want to talk education, NAEP scores. What are you all doing particularly to work with community partners, teacher organizations? You have CAPC, people like Anthony Brown, Cleveland Association of Black School Educators. We're seeing around the country this idea of how you give schools more autonomy at the school level to make decisions. I Promise School in Akron, everyone talks about LeBron James School. How are your school districts really giving accountability to those schools to do what they're supposed to do, but also giving parents choices on where they send their kids? So this idea of autonomy, accountability, and choice in a post-pandemic education system, we're really trying to close these learning losses and really having to accelerate using innovation. So what are you all doing on that?
You know, you bring up a very important point that I don't think we're having a really honest conversation nationally about the future of public education. This is important to me because I'm the only mayor in the state of Ohio that has mayoral control of the schools. Before the pandemic, we're making strides on high school graduation, but post-pandemic, we've seen some of the highest teen suicide rates in America in our public school system. We saw double-digit declines in reading, math, and science scores based on the latest NAEP survey. And now I'm in the process of hiring a brand new CEO to lead our school district for a post-pandemic world. So I want that CEO to exhibit a couple of important qualities. Number one, a proven track record on being disruptive, but also effective in closing the achievement gap for Black and brown students. Because when I talk to parents in my city, their kids are graduating from high school, from a public high school, but they can't pass English 101 at a community college. That is unacceptable. The other thing we need to do a better job of, we have to arm our parents with the resources and the agency they need to advocate for their children. The days have changed where folks have the ability to join the PTA club. So we as city leaders must be innovative to make sure we're empowering our parents to have a seat at the table. The other thing that I'm very concerned about is safety. Just last week, I lost an 8-year-old boy who was shot and killed in front of my mom's alma mater, John Adams High School in Cleveland Southeast Side. I'm not only concerned about the family of that young boy who was killed, but the 25 students who saw that kid being killed in broad daylight. And so we're investing in a multi-million-dollar initiative around trauma-informed care and integrated health in our schools because our children need therapy, they need counseling, they need nurses in the school to meet their social and emotional needs 24/7 and around the clock.
In Seattle, we have a separate elected board of 5 school board members. The superintendent reports to that board. The superintendent is Dr. Brent Jones, an esteemed man of Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, and I was actually his lawyer, and he's a dear friend. And so we have the opportunity to do some unprecedented things. The city's role, first of all, make sure that the kids, they can go to school not hungry. Some of the ancillary work we're doing, number one. And the pre-K work we are funding now through some of our funding sources to make sure the brain development issues are addressed right from 0 to 4. I had no idea that brain development, the data there is so critical toward a kid when they're in the 2nd or 3rd grade. the other piece of this I think is critical. I talked about the soda tax and making sure when kids graduate what they can do. But here's what I think is going to be a game changer for us. That when I look at the companies like, again, Microsoft or Amazon or Tableau or Salesforce, and I go to a room and I said, you know, in my high school, Garfield High School in Seattle, I said it was hard to get FaceTime with a counselor. And when a kid's a sophomore in high school, for example, he or she, they don't know what they're going to do. Sometimes they're thinking about their potential, and they could be, their dreams could be thwarted without the right person. So I'll ask people, how many of you will be willing to mentor, counsel? And I'm looking at our community centers. We have many community centers. We own swimming pools, we own tennis courts, we own playgrounds. And so we recently hired a superintendent of parks to convert our community centers into our gyms. I said, we have some great athletes coming out of Seattle. You know a few. That's cool. But now how do I make sure that I could tap into those people to spend maybe 1 or 2 afternoons with a young child? And so you're going to see this year, my superintendent literally just hired someone last week to spearhead these efforts. I'm saying that let's rewrite the use of a community center. I want them to be safe. So right now, you know, I say now kids are walking around with $1,000 that they can lose their life on in a phone these days. I said, so I want them to be able to get to our community centers. It's a safe haven. And now learn what doors can be unlocked within themselves through mentors. And quite frankly, we own, I think, 4 golf courses. I'm not a golfer. But I said, you know, you got to have an activity, you got to have a hook. Teach this kid the long game and the short game in golf, but then teach them the long game in life. And so these relationships, this relationship capital is going to be critical to our success. That's that informal education becomes so critical in one's development. And we're just starting that work, by the way. That's sort of part of our administration's work.
As you can clearly tell, thanks to these 2 mayors' leadership, our country is in good hands. So please join me in thanking these 2 inspiring leaders. And thank you for coming.